2009. With me today is Councilmember Falcone and Councilmember Schneider, and I'm Roger Horton, Chair of the Finance Committee. The meeting this afternoon is a continuation discussion of the review of the financial and reserve policies of the City of Santa Barbara. This is a continuation from the last meeting, and it is related to the recommendations of the Infrastructure Financing Task Force report. Mr. Pearson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bob Pearson, Finance Director. And as you pointed out, Mr. Chair, this is a continuation of the discussion from last week or 2 weeks ago regarding the Infrastructure Financing Task Force recommendations, specifically as it relates to two things. One, reserve levels, and two, capital funding. And you'll recall that 2 weeks ago I handed out a fairly hefty set of handouts, particularly a compilation of from Moody's Investor Services, the rating agency, dated January 2008. It provided financial medians for the rated California cities. And I do have copies available if anyone wants it, but what I've done instead is I've given you three handouts today. One is entitled Santa Barbara versus California Cities, and that is a summary, a compilation, if you will, of the Moody's financial statistics that was actually a 15 or 16 page report with all the city details on it, different cities. What you see is on the the four rows, if you will, the top row is AA2, which is a rating one notch higher than our Moody's rating. And you see the medians for the AA2 cities, and then below that AA3, which is our rating. And then you see us right below that, so we can compare ourselves to the peer group of ours, which is the AA3 rating.
The AA3 is all the cities that are in the survey that are AA3.
They're all California-rated AA3 cities.
So then you've pulled out our line.
That's correct.
Which is an AA3
yes.
line. Then you said, how do we look versus the cumulative totals of the other cities?
Exactly. So that we can compare ourselves to our peer group, which are the other AA3 rated cities in California. And then right below that you see A1, which is the next rating notch below us. So that's one piece of paper.
One other question, Bob. Do you have any idea of the time period that the ratings were put down? In other words, are the AA2s 06, 07, are they...
This is all as of January 2008.
2008.
Which is the most recent data that Moody's has published.
Yeah. Okay.
I will say that our rating, our AA3 rating, was confirmed by Moody's as recently as December 29th of last year. Yes. The other two handouts, and I just want to tell you what I've handed you, and then I'll actually get into talking about what we're going to talk about. The single piece of paper, two-sided, it's called Reserve Percentage Survey. This was sort of serendipitous. And last week, in between the two meetings, the California Society of Municipal Finance Officers, one of the cities on the listserv, sent out a request for feedback from various cities in terms of their reserve policies, not their actual reserve balances, but do you have a reserve policy, and if so, what is it? And these cities, all of them, including Santa Barbara, because I responded, shows what their reserve policies are. And in a couple cases, it actually shows their actual percent, and then there's a couple notes. So this survey is less than a week old. The other one is a little bit older survey. It's about 6 months old. The California Society of Municipal Finance Officer survey results, listserv survey on reserve policies. So that is essentially the same data, but compiled at a different time. And there's obviously going to be some overlap because some cities responded to both survey requests, some did not. But those are the handouts. And so having explained what those are, I'd kind of like to step back and answer a question.
And maybe you're going to get into this, and maybe I'm just jumping ahead too much, but the percentages on the reserve percentage survey, the most recent one, there are some sort of perplexing numbers, starting with Lawndale,
100%.
that has a policy of 100% reserves.
Yes.
I'm sorry. What does that mean?
That means that they have these
Don't
percentages.
spend any money?
Well, it means they have in reserve 100%, an amount equal to 100% of their annual general fund budget.
Okay, so they've built up a reserve equal to
Yes.
the full amount of their budget.
That's
over time.
correct.
Okay.
And I mean, Councilmember Falcone, I should probably point that out, that these percentages are stated as a percent of the budget, how much in reserves they have, or their policy calls for them to have, as a percent of their general fund budget.
But in a cumulative fashion, this isn't what they put away every year.
No,
So
no, no,
people
correct.
shouldn't think that, well, people put away 50% or 35% or 100% of their budget. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense.
Correct, I agree, it does not. No, it means that their savings account, essentially, their reserve balance, well, in this case, their reserve policy, indicates that they are to have in reserve or in a savings account whatever percentage is displayed here as a percent of their general fund budget. And yes, Lawndale has 100%. Actually, so does Rancho Mirage. So,
If you look at the one that's the Municipal Finance Officer's report,
yes.
I'm perplexed by Berkeley, and I have some friends there in that city government. I'm wondering if I were to call them, would they say, well, that 6% is this, but we actually have sitting here in other accounts, this and this and this and this, because that's Berkeley is. What I was trying to figure out is, do the older cities, for example, have they established some different policy than the newer cities? Because your data here includes some cities that are pretty new,
Sure.
and then ones that are as old as it gets in California.
Right.
So what?
Well, first of all, this data has been provided by the finance department at whatever city is on this list. So the data that's Berkeley was not compiled by someone else. It was submitted by the Berkeley Finance Department. So I would not say that I've looked into every city and looked at the nuances of their financial policies or their accounts or anything like that. I'm simply taking at face value what people have submitted, because each of these has been submitted by the city that's identified. And so I would think that if there were any mitigating factors, they would be mentioned as they are in some cases. Some cities have put notes in there that talk about, or at least mention that there are other factors involved. But these were submitted again by the cities themselves. So, and just to address your older, newer city, my experience is that in terms of establishing a reserve policy, that's less important than the size of the city's general fund budget. I think what you find generally is the smaller the general fund budget, the larger the percentage that they want to have in reserves. And just as an example, if you have a $10 million general fund budget, it might behoove you to have 100%, because $10 million really isn't all that much. And if you have a, $300 or $400 million general fund budget, I would think that the percentage could be lower because the absolute dollars are still substantial.
Well, that was going to be a question down the road a little bit, because it really is misleading if people think that a 50% reserve is equivalent to our 25% reserve, so to speak. And it really does, you have to go deeper into the size of the funds in order to really look dollar to dollar.
Right.
So we'll get into that a little more, I hope.
I agree with you, and I think you'll see evidence of that on this one that's titled California Society of Municipal Finance Officers, where they have actually gone to the trouble of putting in the general fund operating budget amount, so it does give you a little bit of a basis upon which to draw those conclusions. I wanted to back up and remind the committee that which I know you already know, which is that the policy that we currently have in place and have had in place since 1995 in terms of reserves is 25% of the operating budget broken down into two pots, a 15% disaster reserve and a 10% budget reserve. and then a separate capital reserve, which for the enterprise funds is a substantial amount, but for the general fund, the policy establishes a flat $1 million. And again, I know the committee knows this, that currently our disaster reserve is fully funded, the 15%, about $16.5 million. The flat $1 million capital reserve is fully funded. The budget reserve, 10%, is the policy level, would be about $10.5 million, and we currently have just shy of $1 million in that. I mentioned in the agenda report that in the 12 or 13 years since that policy was adopted, we have had changes in our financial practices which really do have a bearing, I think, on the way we look at our reserves, and possibly the policy itself, but certainly the practice. And I mentioned at least one in the agenda report, which is that about 5 or 6 years ago, for example, we started budgeting for vehicle replacement costs differently than we had in the past. In the past, before that, we had budgeted for vehicle replacements on a pay-as-you-go basis, which meant that we looked each year at how much we thought we were going to have to spend next fiscal year to replace vehicles in the general fund, and whatever that was, that's what we would budget. So it was a strictly pay-as-you-go basis. About 5 or 6 years ago, we changed that practice in the budget so that now we essentially fund depreciation on vehicles, and we do that by charging every vehicle in the city a annual rental charge, which is designed to accumulate the money over the life of the vehicle so that when the vehicle reaches its estimated useful life and it's time to be replaced, that money is already in the bank. I want to make that, is that clear to everybody that you know, and that really was a fundamental change in funding a significant capital obligation of the general fund. Currently, in the vehicle replacement fund, the general fund has over $1 million in the vehicle replacement reserve that is sitting there waiting for those vehicles to be replaced. It's earning interest, and the interest is being credited to that. Now, that is something that did not exist when the reserve policies were established in 1995. And one could argue that and I would argue that the reserve policies established in 95 recognized the fact that we were not funding our vehicles on a fully funded basis, but rather we're budgeting them as on a pay-as-you-go basis. And so that really is a fundamental change. And when we look at our general fund reserve balances, we do not include, when we show you the multi-year forecast, for example, we don't include the amount, the $1 million to $1.5 million that's now sitting in that vehicle replacement reserve, because it's not in the general fund. It's in the vehicle replacement fund. However, it is still general fund reserves. And on any given Tuesday, if the council felt they needed to, those monies could be brought back into the general fund. And one could argue that they should be reflected as part of the general fund's reserves. We have not done that, so we've been reporting that conservatively. There's another example of that. It wasn't more than 6 or 7 years ago that in our risk management fund, the actuary said we should have $8 to $9 million in workers' comp reserves, about half of which is the general fund's obligation, and we were really essentially at 50% funding on that. In the intervening years, the reserve requirements in our risk management fund have declined thanks to our excellent loss history over the last 5 years, while at the same time we have upped the funding level for our risk management fund to the point where, as you well know now, up until recently, we had about $4.5 to $5 million in the risk management fund above and beyond the actuarially required reserves. That's been fortunate because we've been drawing down on some of those excess reserves over the last year, this year in particular, to help keep the budget balanced. But that's another example of where at the time the reserve policy was established, those risk management reserves were underfunded. Now they're overfunded, and yet we don't report those when we report general fund reserves to you, despite the fact that 50% of that excess is essentially general fund money. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that since 1995, when these policies were established, we have had changed financial practices which, while not always reflected in the reserves that we report to the City Council and the public as part of our multi-year forecasting process, clearly there's more financial depth there than what we have reported. So I would say to you that, in my professional opinion, the reserve levels are not as depleted as they might at first glance seem, and that you have to look at the broader net and look at these other pots of money that the general fund has accumulated to take care of specific capital needs.
Oh, Ms. O'Connor?
Mr. Pearson, I don't mean to be a nitpicker, and maybe this is not relevant, and this is not about you or your information, which is all accurate because it's provided by the cities themselves. But I'm wondering how useful it is to compare two other cities when there are at least a dozen or so different ways that these numbers are calculated, in that some take 25% of general fund expenditures, others take 30% of estimated annual revenues, others take 8% of operating expenditures, 50% of general fund operating budget. I mean, these are all different kettles of fish here. So help me to reconcile how I'm supposed to know whether Rancho Palos Verdes, who wants 50% of their estimated annual revenues and only has $43,000 in their reserves out of a $14 million general operating fund. I mean, it's those sorts of numbers that are sort of upside down. I mean,
no, I think that
explain how an estimated annual revenue up against an operating expenditure is supposed to be comparable.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, my assumption is that cities adopt balanced budgets. And if they adopt a balanced budget, then operating revenues equal operating expenditures. And so if a city chooses to measure their reserve policy against revenues or expenses, I'm assuming that that's really are the same bases.
Those could be 6 of one, half dozen of another.
Right. Now, is it always true that that's the case? No, I could not and would not say that. But I think in general, some cities measure it as a percent of revenue and others as a percent of expenditures. I can tell you that Moody's measures it. They choose to measure it as a percent of revenue. That's the way the Moody's data is compiled. And I think it's true. I mean, there's no, I think your point is well taken, that there is no sort of one-size-fits-all. Different cities choose to characterize and measure them and state their policies one way, and certain cities choose another way. Way back in 95, we chose to measure it against the operating budget, the expenditures.
I guess my point is that one size doesn't fit all.
Right.
And that everybody chooses their own sort of medicine, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And just comparing, going down the reserve percentages is a shallow analysis.
I would
or can you say that it does reflect?
I would say that while any one or two cities may not be comparable, to me, the value in this information is that it provides some context. Not that somehow it's a formula-driven thing that we can just say, oh, look, everybody seems to be at 50% or 25% or 30%. No, I would agree with you that it isn't that simple.
Okay,
or formulaic. But I think it does help to
yeah.
provide some context to see, within a range what cities are doing. And I agree that small cities, large cities vary. I just think, to me, the question we hear oftentimes is, well, what are other cities doing? And I think that this at least tries to provide some context to it, to see whether we're way out there all by ourselves at one end of the spectrum, or do we seem to be at least within the spectrum. And that's all, to me, that this is meant to do, is to provide some comfort that other cities are looking at sort of the same continuum that we are, something in that neighborhood.
And just let me correct that when I stated that Rancho Palos Verdes had 43,000 in the bank, that was actually a population figure, but we really don't know by this information what exactly, do they actually have 50% of their 14.5 million as a reserve? I mean, that information isn't here.
No,
is that correct?
that's correct. These are policies established, not actual funding levels, whereas the Moody's data is just the opposite. It does not speak to policies, it speaks to actual funding levels, right.
It seems to me that there's a few things that this committee is charged with looking at. And first thing I would say is that there isn't any absolute percentage or ratio that applies here. In some government financing, there are some ratios that are pretty set. For example, in hospital financing, there's some ratios that they use that if they don't have it, they get criticized. But in the case of cities, that isn't the case. And so I think our charge is to, one, determine if our existing policies, which we talked about, are 25% basically, and then some funding for capital. If those seem to make sense in a contemporary look at it, because they were set almost 15 years ago, and then if we agree with that, how do we go about in the future from here on out, based to some extent on the IFT report, getting ourselves there? And I'll just state my conclusion, and I've been looking at this thing for almost 8 years now, is that I'm pretty comfortable with the percentages that we have. I wasn't so sure of that a while back, but with the uncertainties that we have, looking at things now, I think these numbers that we have are okay. I don't feel a pressing need to change these ratios. I'm okay with it, and I think we'll see how the rest of the committee feels on that. But then the question would be, how do we address the recommendations in the report and any changes that we want to make to try to get so that we actually have these reserves? So that's kind of where I'm coming from on it.
Thanks. To follow up on that, first off, thank you for the information, and I think as has been mentioned before, it's just that it's information, and we can take from it what we can, but it's obviously different depending on the type of city, population. We don't even know if they're following their own policies. I mean, we have down here in ours that, our policy is 25%, and we're not at 25%, and that's the question we have before us. I guess for me, in terms of figuring out if these percentages are the right ones when they were established in 1995. I have two thoughts. One, first off, and I've said this for years, the $1 million cap on capital, it makes no sense to keep that there. There are other ways, and actually to me, it relates to another infrastructure financing task force recommendation of how much money we put aside each year in the budget to spend on capital projects. And it's actually a spending budget, not a reserve budget. So that's part of the budgeting process. So to me, some of this is interlinked. But that 1 million cap doesn't really give us very much anymore. Maybe it gave us a little more in 1995, but not anymore. So that to me needs to move somewhere, because it's been there forever, and I don't really see what the value of that is. Now the 15 and 10%. To me, the questions to ask of whether those are the right numbers is, what do we want to get out of, let's say we were fully funded in that 10 and 15%. What value does that give to us? What benefit does that give to the city? And the things that come to my mind looking at Moody's is, what kind of credit rating do we want to continue to have in the city? Do we want to stay at a AA3? Do we want to be somewhere else? And how does our policy reserves and meeting those reserves reflect that? Because that obviously has implications on how we can sell bonds or do other financial interactions and transactions within the city, and that's important. So that's one question. The other question is, what does 10% of an operating budget reserve really mean in terms of an economic downturn, and then the 15% for a natural disaster? I mean, what is that really going to help us in the cases where we claim it's there to have? So if there's a major earthquake or a tsunami or something, is that 15% disaster reserves really adequate in terms of moving us along while we're waiting for federal and state of emergency funds, which would happen in those situations, to actually come forward? So if, for example, FEMA had a requirement that the city had to put in 20% or 10% of its for replacement of disaster reserves, that's going to help me figure out what that right number is. And so that kind of context, I think, is important. On a gut level, I mean, 25% total seems right, but in terms of actually, continuing that policy on into the future, and there might be other kind of results-oriented type of criteria that we want to establish, before reestablishing these percentages. So I guess the question is, what is the intent behind having these percentages as above and beyond it feels good, So if you could comment on that, perhaps that would help.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Schneider, I know that, having been here in '95 when it was established, that the 25% in the aggregate was established because it was felt that represents 3 months worth of operating expenses for the general fund, and it was felt that was an adequate cushion for the general fund, that within 3 months, in the case of a disaster or whatever, that would be plenty of time in which to see reimbursement from federal agencies, FEMA, state OES, now called CalEMA, insurance recoveries, and the like. So that was the sort of the thought behind the 25%. And I would say that I think, and Jim may want to comment on this, but I think that from staff's perspective, we feel that despite the changes in the financial practices, some of which I mentioned moments ago, that the 25% as a policy is still, remarkably 15 years later, is still a good number. And that seems to be within the continuum that we see other cities have. I will also mention to you that the airport bond that Moody's just rated, they specifically mentioned, as you know, that's a general fund backed deal. They specifically mentioned in the rating write-up that our reserves were not policy level, but actual level, were down to the lower end of our peer group of the AA3, and that if our reserve levels continued to deteriorate, that it would jeopardize our AA3 rating. And so I think that is an indication that from a rating agency standpoint, that, since our policy is 25% and we're probably at about 18 or 19% right now, that to me, that says that Moody's kind of thinks that 25% is a reasonable amount, because that seems to be where the AA3 rating group is kind of averaging. Yeah. And I for one think that it's critically important that we maintain our AA3 rating. I handed out to you the last time the Moody's rating scale, and really below AA3 you're going to single A, and that is a significant notch down. It's considered upper medium grade. Okay, anything with an A1, A2, A3 is considered upper medium grade. Whereas the AA1, 2, and 3, and we're at the bottom of that with the AA3, is considered judged to be of high quality. So, to me, I think this city belongs in the high quality and not the upper medium grade. Right,
I would agree. So I think if in establishing the percentages in the policy, that kind of information needs to be put into the rationale behind why we set the policies levels where we set them. The other thing I want to mention, and I want to bring back, you mentioned the risk management pool reserve and the vehicle replacement reserve. I think in the interest of transparency, when the public wants to look at our budget and wants to look at what our reserves are, that the more we can keep in one category, the better. Now, we can subcategorize them, so out of the X percentage, we can have a certain amount that's dedicated to risk management, a certain amount is dedicated, like we already have. But to have them in different pots, I think creates more questions and concerns and queries than understanding about how the city budget works. So that might be something we want to incorporate in, or I just bring that up and ask if that's possible and how that would, play itself out.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Schneider, I certainly would agree that the pots of money that are dedicated general fund pots of money, like the vehicle replacement account, which is, I just looked at, it's $1.5 million, which is not inconsequential. That's a substantial amount of money. Should be mentioned, and probably, it certainly hasn't been mentioned much over the last couple of years as that reserve account has been growing. So I mean, I would agree that in order to get a complete financial picture of the general fund, these other pots of money, these other reserves that are clearly general fund. I mean, if you looked on our books in the vehicle replacement fund, you're going to see a line called General Fund Vehicle Reserves. And then you're going to see another line that says Enterprise Fund Vehicle Reserves, and they are segregated. So it's clearly, we track them, and it's general fund and by fund, and we can, whether it's the water fund. So a considerable sum of money like that, I would agree that it's worth reminding and keeping on our reserve discussions whenever it comes up. If I think that's what you're suggesting, and if so, I agree.
So if it would, let's say we kept the 15 disaster and 10% operating, we move the $1.5 million over, I guess would go to the operating, and if the worst case scenario you mentioned of having 3 months worth of reserves available in a disaster, we would then, the council at that point would just say, well, that fund that's currently designated for vehicle replacement, we're going to redesignate for disaster recovery.
Right.
And that's, but the money in terms of where it is in the budget, I think will be more clear in terms of if anyone wants to look to see how healthy the city budget is or something like that. So that is something I think we ought to do, and there might be other examples like that. Because from what I understand you said, from in 1995 there was no vehicle replacement fund reserve. It was part of the 10%, and it's sort of been carved out.
That's correct.
And put over on the side.
That's correct.
But I think the original intent of that 10% was to include those kind of funds, and I would agree with the council from then that when they established it, that we should keep things more clearly allocated.
So, Ms. Falcone, did you have a comment?
I do. I, too, would like to see in the aggregate what has now been moved around to different places that originally comprised the 10%. I think that's useful information. However, one of the things that has been mentioned here that I think needs to be clearly parsed out is that we're referring to the 25% in terms of recovering from a disaster, when truly it's only the 15% that is set aside to recover from a disaster. The other 10% is to be used for ongoing operations, such as vehicle replacement, such as a couple of the other things that you mentioned, but also such as salaries is an ongoing operation. And so I think that to say we have 25% to recover from a disaster is using a tremendously false number. It's really 15% to recover from a disaster. Now, if Moody's wants us to have 25%, as you say, for the AA3, to not fall below that, then we need to truly re-examine what we need to have, because our 15% disaster funds have never, ever been violated, if you will. True? Okay.
True statement.
So, I think we need to be extremely clear here about exactly what monies are being designated for what. And if we want to reevaluate the numbers, we have to be very careful to make sure that we are truly reevaluating numbers for specific purposes. So if Moody's wants us to have 25% for disasters, that's a whole different ballgame.
Councilmember Falcone, I don't think Moody's cares how we designate.
Well,
the
then if
different
we
pots.
want to have, if we're talking in terms of having 25% for 3 months worth of, recovering from a disaster waiting for FEMA,
Right.
which is something that has been alluded to here, then we're still talking about something quite different than 15% for disaster and 10% for operating. I mean, you can cobble it all together if you like,
Yeah.
but that's not the kind of analysis we're being asked to make.
Well, I'm not sure. I don't know. I mean, to me, the 25%, if you take the 10% budget reserve and if you say what was the intent of that budget reserve, that 10%, that 10% was intended to be essentially a shock absorber that would allow the city some flexibility to deal with the economic situation as it comes and it goes. And in theory, and for the longest time I can tell you it worked this way, was that in good economic times, let's start with the bad. In the bad economic times, we would draw down our budget reserve because that's what it's there for.
Which is what we've done.
Right. And then in good economic times, those reserves would then be restored.
Which we haven't had any.
Which, well, okay.
We've had minimal.
And that ends up being the shock absorber. And I've said this publicly before recently, that if our budget reserve were at the fully funded $10.5 million level right now, I think that as we're looking at preparing next year's FY 2010 budget, we would be in a completely different situation than we are now. Because we would be able to use, in fact, it would be exactly what that reserve is there for, to use those reserves to cushion this extraordinary economic situation. Unfortunately, we don't have that flexibility right now because there's $1 million left in it, not 10.5. But that is the concept behind the 10.5, the 10%, if you will, and it's supposed to sort of trend around that 10% policy line. And you use it when you need to, and you restore it when you can. And in theory, given over a period of 5 or 10 years, that we should have 25% in the reserve account on average. And the fact of the matter is that if a disaster hits, whether it's 10%, 15%, or all 25% in one designated group, we will use what we have to respond to a disaster.
Sure, understood. And I don't mean to say that the 10% wouldn't be available for a disaster. Of course it would. I mean, it's money that's there, and if we need it and so forth. But over the since 9/11, 2001, arguably, that was an extraordinary economic time when things went fairly far south for a lot of factors. And there have been a number of budget crises. Granted, the global meltdown we're in now, which was unforeseeable by anybody much, is fairly extraordinary. But arguably, we've been in a decade's worth of unpleasantness with a few years of exception. So I guess my question still is the 15% for disaster really maybe too low? And the 10% for operating ongoing budgetary sorts of crises and unpleasantness and so forth maybe is right, because we haven't, over the last 10 years, gone completely out of the 10%. So maybe that does work, even in this decade of bad times. But I'm really questioning the 15% disaster reserve policy at this point, based on this conversation today.
That's a valid question. My feeling about that, and I have thought about that, is that we really do have, when we look at the 25% as a number, I really look at that as a number that is to be strived for, and that since it's general fund money, on any given Tuesday, that money can be directed as we need to. Another factor, of course, is the reserve accounts that you mentioned today, which we haven't been looking at. And I think there's another one, which is an employee loan reserve, which we haven't talked about, but I think there's some money in there, too. And so if you look at that, altogether, we are actually maybe not at 25%, but if we add these things all up, we're over 20% in reserves. I think is a fair statement. Maybe it's 20 or 21 or something like that. I don't know. But I feel okay with that, and I would like to though address pretty heavily what the infrastructure task force report did, which is how do we get to a better way of planning for the capital needs of the city as our city gets older, and we look around and we see the buildings and the restrooms and everything deteriorating. How can we keep our budget and disaster reserves at least where they are, and then find a more rigorous way of addressing those needs. And I know you and I have talked offline a little bit about this, and maybe that's a different meeting where we get into that.
I was planning on bringing it up today to at least get it on the table, and that is that, you're right. I mean, the Infrastructure Financing Task Force recommended that we review the reserve policies and that we review and find a way to commit to, over time, increasing the amount of money that the city general fund is able to dedicate to capital. And to me, these are interrelated issues. And, I was thinking back sort of reaching for a historical perspective, and in discussions about this issue, I came to realize that there was a time back when this reserve policy was established, and I thought, well, how did we first manage to fully fund these reserves? How did we get them fully funded? And the answer to that question was that the infamous year-end variance. What we had done in the past was we did not budget for a year-end variance. And what that meant was that if you assume for the moment, and I understand that this assumption is not particularly a valid one in this year or maybe even next, but if you assume for the moment that we make our revenue estimates. Now, we know we're in extraordinary times now, and we're not going to make our revenue estimates this year, and maybe not next year, who knows. But in the grand scheme of things, we budget revenues conservatively enough that I think that's a fairly safe assumption on an ongoing long-term basis. Then we know that we come in under budget on the expense side by anywhere from $1.5 to $2.5 million a year. And that money in the past, sometimes it was as much when revenues go over budget, that we were generating year-end surplus of $3.5 to $4 million a year. And what was happening was a portion of that year-end surplus was then being left to fall to fund balance, to reserves, because it was a surplus. The other portion of it, or another portion of it, was dedicated to capital. And it was used to fund capital actually 2 years down the road when the money was already in the bank and we knew that, yes, this was the surplus that we generated from the year before last. It's in the bank. It sits in the bank a year. And then as we prepare the next budget, it's available to spend on capital. And that year-end surplus funded both the maintained the reserves at policy levels and was able to fund a fairly substantial capital program. And when you think back to 15 years ago, 95, 96, when the general fund budget was probably half of what it is now, that was a substantial amount of money. I mean, spending $2 to $2.5 million a year on capital, comparable now would be $5 or $6 million. And I think that what staff would ask the committee to consider is that if for fiscal year 2011, in other words, the budget you will be about ready to see a year from now, if we, at that point, change the practice to not budget any year-end variance, but then left that to be a surplus at the end of the year, a portion of that, say half of it, could then be left to fall to fund balance and to replenish reserves, and would give us a credible way to restore reserves back to policy levels, and also would allow a portion of it then, say the other half of it, to be used for capital, which could then augment the amount of capital spending that we already have. And so I think that would be one approach that would allow us to accomplish both of those objectives that had been recommended by the IFT, which is to augment our ongoing capital expenditures as well as restoring reserves to policy levels. And that could happen beginning in fiscal year 2011, and simply would be done by not budgeting any year-end variance.
My response to that would be harking back on another local institution that I was budget director for, and we had established unfunded encumbrances, which had gone through a priority ranking already, and so they were valid encumbrances. And that type of money could be used to, in some cases also, encumbrances were established, and then, let's say it was a piece of scientific equipment that might have gone up in price. And so these year-end balances were used to fund those types of activities. And that practice, I think, is legitimate. And I think it's certainly needs more debate than just a few minutes today, but I think it's worth taking a good look at from my perspective.
I also, go ahead. Did you want to?
Oh, thanks. We're talking here about the general fund, not about any of the enterprise funds, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So any of the capital that is charged to the airport or charged to the waterfront or charged to the water fund or the wastewater fund or the golf course, to some extent even streets, they all have their own reserves. Do they not?
They do. The enterprise funds do. Streets fund really does not.
Streets fund doesn't. Okay, so
Right.
that's unique. But all of the other funds that I mentioned do. They
Yes.
have a 15% of their operating budget as disaster and 10% operating as well. So they each have 25% of their operating budget in reserves,
Plus a capital reserve. That's correct.
plus their own capital reserve.
Yes.
And is it still correct to say that none of those, or at least very few, not substantially, are impacted by any of these revenue circumstances that we're in the general fund? In other words, their reserves are intact.
Those are two different things. Yes, their reserves are intact, and the enterprise fund reserve balances, the operating, the 25%, are fully funded.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's fair to say that none of the enterprise fund revenues are being impacted by the current economic situation. I think it's clear that some of our enterprise fund revenues are indeed being impacted by the current
But so
economic
far
situation.
their reserves have not been, they haven't had to draw on their reserves to balance their budgets so far?
So far, that's correct.
Okay. Do we anticipate that will happen for this coming
It's
year?
possible. The golf fund, for example, is one
Yeah,
of the
the
ones
golf is in
that's
trouble, yeah.
having difficulties. The airport and waterfront funds are also feeling the pinch. The parking fund is feeling the pinch. I would say that at least at this point, it's our expectation that those enterprise fund budgets will be submitted balanced without the use of reserves. But that doesn't mean that there aren't that adjustments haven't been required to maintain that
Right.
balance.
Okay. So really, we're looking at a very compartmentalized portion of the budget,
Yes.
the general fund.
Yes, indeed.
Now, when you ask us to review the policies in terms of the 25%, the 15 and 10, is that citywide or is that just the general fund?
Well, my expectation was that it's a citywide policy, but
Well, it is a citywide policy, but are you asking us to compartmentalize?
no.
the change.
I'm asking you to consider the citywide policy, and we have not talked about that yet. But if there was a rationale that this committee or anybody else felt that would warrant differentiating reserve policies between general fund and enterprise fund. There's certainly no golden rule that says you can't do that and have a different reserve policy for the general fund as opposed to the enterprise funds. I will tell you that one of the things that allows the enterprise funds more stability is that they can control their revenue streams because they have the ability to change their rates without going to
They're
a vote of the
fee-based.
people.
We are
That's correct, tax-based.
in the general fund.
And
Big difference.
That's correct. That's
Okay,
correct.
well, that needs to be clear to all those who might be listening and writing and things. If there was a tsunami, for instance, and the harbor were impacted or the wharf were impacted, that would first fall to the waterfront disaster fund, would it not?
Yes, it would.
And so the 15% general fund disaster portion would be to supplement that?
No, the 15% general fund would be to address damage to city
Something
general fund facilities.
Outside of the waterfront?
Yes.
So
Police station,
what
fire
we're talking about in
stations.
terms of the general fund disaster reserve has absolutely nothing to do with the waterfront or the airport.
Well, that's yes, except that I would point out that the general fund, for example, has facilities in the waterfront area, i.e., the Cabrillo Arts Center,
No,
the
understood.
Chase Palm Park Rec Center.
But not the wharf, not the harbor.
That's
not-
correct. That's absolutely right.
It's difficult for people to understand without a flow chart exactly how all of this fits together because it's not linear necessarily. Thank you.
Schneider?
Thank you. Okay, two things. The Infrastructure Task Force recommendation for spending capital within the general fund is 10% of the operating budget should be used to actually spend, not keep in reserves, but to spend on capital projects, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So there's that recommendation over here, and then there's the policy reserve percentages and the mechanism of how we get back up to those percentages should we keep the percentages where they are. And so what you're suggesting with the variance is a mechanism to meet both recommendations over time.
That's correct.
Okay. And I like that idea. In 2011 might have to be realistically the best chance to plan for it because of the current economic crisis, but one for as a way to move in that direction, but also it makes me think that it will make us as council and future councils and staff be a little more disciplined in when they put their budget together, as opposed to seeing this $3 million cushion for operating, as opposed to that variance that we hope that we would get each year is either going to go back to help fund our reserve policy or actually go to capital projects, which will help the general fund in one way or another over time. So I tend to like that shift back to that funding going towards more static, it helps us squeeze into the operating budget, which is something we need to do now because of the current economic crisis, but then moving forward into being a more efficient government in general, in the general fund. So I like it for that reason. I want to go back to something Ms. Falcone mentioned about is 15% enough for disaster relief? And perhaps, if Moody's says 25% and we don't care how you slice the pie, but it's just the cumulative amount actually in the bank, not what the policy is, but in the bank, is really what our goal is, to stay a AA3 rated city. That to me is like that's the brass ring. That's where we want to head and reach as much as we can. So what policies can we put in place to make sure we keep that 25% reserve actually in the bank? And perhaps, again, for disciplinary reasons, in terms of when we put the budget together, perhaps it is worth, for the general fund only, to look at a 20% disaster relief reserve and reduce the 10% to 5% for operating. And I say this because I know for me, and I believe from hearing comments from my colleagues on the Finance Committee and the rest of the Council, that this disaster relief fund is sacrosanct. You do not touch the disaster relief fund. You know, it's there. You don't touch. It's like it'd be political suicide to, take a dollar out of that because it's called the disaster relief fund. And if in fact the whole purpose of having the reserves is to help us in severe economic times, then maybe by moving that percentage up slightly gives us less wiggle room to actually take away this little pot of money. Ooh, $10 million. That, we can do a little bit of here. Just for this one time only. Because frankly, that's really how we got a little bit to where we are today of being truly in a big economic downturn and not having the cushion that normally we would look to. Because as far as I'm concerned, and I hear others say, we're not looking into the next budget of touching any reserves because there's no reserves to touch because there's only $1 million left in the general operating 10% piece, and by God, we're not going to touch that disaster relief piece because that's something we're just putting our foot down. So if getting back to what I said earlier, if the goal of having the percentages of 25% reserve is to keep us in good standing in the marketplace, how we keep that, it's just as important that we establish a policy to keep that money in the reserve bank as it is just to have the policy in and of itself. So that might be one way to try to shape our thinking of how we budget in future years. So that's on the reserve policy. I also want to mention the general fund capital spending piece that I want to ask also. If the goal is 10%, I think, again, we need to look at where are all the different areas in the current budget that we're currently using to spend on capital in the general fund. There's already a capital fund budget of $1.5 million or so.
Roughly.
Roughly.
It's less than that right now.
Right, and in that are things like for ADA improvements and sustainability stuff, but there's the $1.5 million already there. So okay, so that's part of it. Then there's this $1 million reserve thing if we want to move over as a way, but that's like a one-time shift, and then we need to fund that continually. Then there's the piece from the variance that can move over, but the other piece, and perhaps this will help us leverage over time, is the redevelopment agency in as much as we spend capital money on general fund capital projects. For example, the Carrillo Rec Center or the police station or the fire station. Only those pieces. Because once the RDA goes away, we're going to have to find general fund money to do those kind of projects into the future. But I don't see why we couldn't count that as part of reaching our policy of spending capital dollars for general fund projects. And as the redevelopment agency sunsets, that might help us leverage, how do you increase the general fund portion for capital as the redevelopment agency moves down. So I thought I'd just ask that and see if that makes sense at all in terms of how the policy's written or read or...
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Schneider, I think it's fair to say that the three projects in particular that you mentioned that are being funded by the RDA, as we know, they're multi-million-dollar projects, and they're multi-year projects. But the fact is that if you count those towards what we're spending as a city on general fund capital needs, those are general fund facilities. And I think it's kind of a good news, bad news story. The good news is that that's a lot of money that I would agree with you one way or another. It's general fund capital. It may be funded by the redevelopment agency, but it's general fund capital. And if you take those projects and you average how much we spend on each one of those three over a 2 or 3 year period, we're probably reaching what the ITF recommended the 10%. Because the other thing that hasn't been mentioned yet is the vehicle spending, which we don't really count as capital now, but we used to. You used to be able to look at our capital budget in the general fund, and you'd see $800,000 vehicle replacement. That's under the old methodology that I mentioned earlier. Now that it's built into the budget as essentially a vehicle rental charge, where the money then gets moved in and accumulated, when we spend it out of the vehicle replacement fund, that really isn't considered part of the general fund capital program, and it varies year to year depending on what vehicles need to be replaced. And then, as the ITF noted, we're also spending money out of the general fund on facilities maintenance.
Right.
Now, they recommend we spend more, but they clearly recognized, and in their report they acknowledge that we're spending that. So the $1 million to $1.5 million that we budget as a capital budget in the general fund does not completely capture all capital expenditures on the general fund. And to get back to the RDA thing, I said kind of a good news, bad news. The good news is that we have that available, and it's providing substantial improvements to general fund facilities right now. But as you know, within the next, 6 or 7 years, that's going to go away,
Right.
and we will lose that ability. Now,
It gives us time to plan.
Well, I agree
for
with
it.
you.
And because I guess I'll end my comments with, when I first saw the 10% of the general fund budget should go towards actually expending on capital projects, my eyes were wide open because how in the world do we do that? But in fact, if we are much more along than we think we are because of, again, all the different line items that go towards capital, I think we need a better understanding of where we are, and if the intent of the task force was to say, we don't, the money should go to, the intent of the task force was to make sure that the general fund capital needs are being taken care of. And so if over the course of time redevelopment agency money is being used to help reach that goal, to me, I think, and maybe we need to double check with them, but that meets the intent behind their recommendation. Now, ultimately, we need to find a way to do that over the long course of time, and when the redevelopment agency sunsets, we won't have that opportunity, but it gives us a chance to get there. And so to me, then that 10% number seems easier to reach than when I first heard it, because I thought we were at 1.5%, when in fact we're much more than that.
I agree. And keep in mind that when the RDA does sunset, we will lose $1 of tax increment revenue, which is the RDA, for every dollar. But what it means is that $1 of property tax money goes back into the property tax allocation pool that the county manages on behalf of all Santa Barbara County agencies, and our general fund will get about 20 cents of that dollar. So we will, it's not exactly a fair trade. We'll lose $1 out of the RDA. We'll lose the whole dollar. But the general fund will get back about 20 cents of that dollar. And one of the opportunities that we may have when that happens in 2015 or 2016 or 2017, whenever it actually happens, is to recognize that incremental property tax revenue, those 20 cents on the dollar that's going to be general fund, and to say that is essentially the residual of what the redevelopment agency was getting, and now's our chance to use a good portion of that to continue the good work that the RDA was doing for capital. Now, yeah, but that's certainly an option.
Ms. Falcone.
We could earmark it that way, but you'd have to get past the housing advocates first, of which I probably would be one. But remind me again when it is that we took the variance and started budgeting it out in the open, if you will, as opposed to at the end of the year. We changed it, what was it, 5-6 years ago or something?
I would say that's about right.
Okay. And we did that because?
We did that because...
Remind me.
Yeah, we did that because at the time, I think it was post 9/11, which, as you pointed out earlier today, was a difficult economic time. And we realized that we were ending the year with this surplus because of the variance.
Consistently.
And that essentially what we were doing in order to balance the budget, we were balancing the budget and then recognizing that we'd get to the end of the year and there would be $1.5 million to $3 million left over and we said, look, these are difficult times. Let's build that into the budget so that we don't overcut the organization. And that's kind of how it started. And when we first started, we didn't actually budget the year-end variance. We actually would adopt an unbalanced budget, and the gap at the bottom, we would say, well, that's okay because that will be liquidated, if you will, at the end of the year by the variance. And then it was another half step from there to actually budgeting it.
Right.
To show that, yes, that's a balance.
So we've incrementally come along to putting the variance in the budget, and now the recommendation is to take that variance or the projected variance every year, back it out of the budget, and earmark it part and part for capital. So we're kind of back where we started, except the variance is being recognized in a slightly different way. But we've just gone back to the way it was, although we're earmarking the money.
That's essentially correct.
That's basically what
Yes.
what you're recommending.
Isn't the difference, though, Mr. Pearson, is that, I mean, we're using the variance now to help our operating budget, which is what I heard, but from what I'm hearing from you is that the variance would then be used for reserves and for capital.
That's correct, but
Yeah.
I think that they're not inconsistent statements, and,
Yeah.
and Jim just reminded me that for 2010, next year, we're only, and we told you this when we presented to you the sort of big picture balancing strategy, that we're only proposing to budget half of the usual year-end variance, which is the expenditure under budget piece, whereas normally we'd been budgeting a year-end variance of about $2.25 million,
Right.
and a portion of that was to reflect revenues over, and a portion to reflect expenditures under. And we recognize that in this current economic environment, it's probably not realistic to be budgeting a portion of the variance for the revenues over, because that's
Not happening.
not probably going to happen.
Right.
So for
Right.
2010,
but my point is that
and I think you're right. Yes.
we've folded it in at the end at one point in time.
Yes.
Then we brought it incrementally out to use for operating because of economic hard times. And now, because we've gone through some of our reserves, which arguably are there for economic hard times, we want to build back the reserves, so we're going to back this back out of the operating, which actually leaves us that much shorter in our continual operating budget if we do this.
That's correct. And to me, there's only
So it's a little bit of, I don't want to say smoke and mirrors, but somebody out there will.
yes.
And
Yeah.
actually it is sort of moving the shells around.
Well, I would agree. And the fact is that there's only one way to restore reserves. Only
Save the
one
money.
way. And that's to spend less than we take in, and to take
That's
that
right.
other piece of it.
But
and-
this isn't necessarily doing that. Or it will,
Yeah, it
because
is.
because if we cut the operating costs, then we're going to be cutting
Yes.
services and various other things.
That's correct.
Right.
Right. So, okay.
Okay. So we've had a lot of discussion. Have we pretty well covered the topics for today? And
Yes,
then
sir.
Are we scheduling another couple of meetings on this?
Well, we will be. There isn't one next week, and then the following week, the 31st, there's no council meeting, so we'll
Okay.
be back to you in the first meeting in April.
Fine. Okay, Mr. Armstrong?
And let me make a suggestion that what we will do is write up what we thought we heard as a policy and then bring it back
It'll
to
be
you.
interesting to see what you write up.
And just what I think I heard is a policy that would look something like that. In fiscal year 2011, we would no longer budget the variance. And then in any year in which we had a surplus, half of those monies would go to go into reserves, whether we call them budget reserves or disaster reserves, and half would go into a capital fund. We would also take the $1 million that we currently have, what we call capital reserve, we'd put it in that capital fund. And then I'll just add one other thing, because I'm an optimist, and that is when we get up to 25% of our reserves, and my recommendation is when you have a surplus, all of it would drop into that capital fund. And so basically you'd have a 25% reserve, and anything on top of that would just go into the capital fund, because that helps you get to that 10% in the good years. Now hopefully that'll be a problem we'll have in 2 or 3 years from now, but I think it may be longer.
Sounds pretty close. Any other items for the agenda today? Then let's adjourn the meeting. Thank you.